chapter, and Hebrews chapter 11 lists a lot of names of people and talks about their faith. And so we have the definition of faith at the beginning of the chapter, but these short discussions, verse by verse, define faith for us in action. And faith is not really faith unless it is in action. I'm trying to get this so I could see, but I don't know if I can. If Matt was here, we could get it. I can't see who's on, but that's all right. So we were looking at last time, actually, Abraham. And he's one of those who has a number of the incidents in his life mentioned as examples of faith, which tells us something that sometimes we're tested more than once in life. And so that's something we can learn from Abraham. But he's one who moved into a different country. And the emphasis is on the fact that he was looking for a better country, a heavenly one. We wish we knew more about that.
I want to comment.
Okay.
When in Genesis chapter 12, God says, that He will show that He will leave, and I will, land I will show you.
Yeah.
That the Hebrew word, for land is eretz, which is the Hebrew and the Greek. It's broader. That's not necessarily. It can mean generally any piece of land. It could be your house. In the context of like the flood, eretz, the context, the world. So eretz can mean like the world. It can mean like your house. This piece of land, it could be the state of Illinois. It could be the Chicago land. So I'm trying to give you an idea how the Hebrew word for when God says, "I will show you this land," is being used, and the word
is kind of an expansive concept, is what
right,
you said.
and the word to see is the same, or show, or see is the same word used for the word that was given to Moses. See to it that the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. So what I'm trying to say is that it appears that there's a bit of in Genesis 12, there's a bit of typology that we don't know what God showed Abraham. But we see that the immediate situation is certainly the land of Palestine, but there may have been more shown to Abraham than what is actually recorded in the text. Like Moses had to, make the things according to the pattern that was shown to him on the mountain.
Okay.
So there may have been something, he's not pulling, the Hebrew writer's not just pulling this out of air, that, somehow he saw it.
We are not. The borders are not defined.
Also, the Hebrew writer and David saw that the rest promised to the Israelites in Canaan is a type of rest to come. So what I'm trying to say is simply that there is support that possibly God revealed to Abraham more than what is let on in the Genesis text.
Okay. And we know that the promise was that they would control land, not just in what we know as Palestine, but extending on up to the Euphrates River, and that was fulfilled during the time of Solomon.
Right.
So, but the whole point though, in these verses, is that in spite of those expansive promises, they were looking for something better than that.
Because if I were
The heavenly Jerusalem.
I would complain, like, wait a minute, this land is mine, but I'm not being paid any rent. I'm gonna be paid for, come on, you know, what's
Anyway.
going on here?
What I wanted to focus on, and before we move on from that, is, we look upon that as the promised land. But the Lord in Leviticus says, and we know this from the land must not be sold permanently, it referred to in the year of Jubilee, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. And that's interesting, that even from the very beginning, it's not theirs, they're tenants. They look upon it as their land, the promised land, but they're just there temporarily. And that's what these extensive rules were to lead them to think about. I may buy a field, but at the end of 50 years, it goes back to somebody else. It's not really mine. And that was to get that spiritual message to them. And so we wish we knew more about how they longed for a better country, a heavenly one. Did God give more details about what he had in store for Abraham than just his descendants occupying the land of Canaan? Anyway, we talked about that. And God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. A city, not just a country. And we know it as the heavenly Jerusalem, or the New Jerusalem. So anyway, they had faith based upon what God told them, that led them to move, led him to believe in God's promise of a son, to offer his son as a sacrifice. And that was Abraham. So any more comments about Abraham? I just thought we mentioned, he's mentioned in several verses there. The next fellow, by faith Isaac, blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. We don't have as much information about Isaac and his life of faith. He's lived in tents and lived there in Canaan. But this is interesting that they mention this incident in his life. One Bible teacher years ago that I was in said, well, Isaac, he was just a mama's boy. He wasn't very active. I don't know if that was true or not, but it always stuck with me. He seems to be doesn't have as much description about his life as Abraham or Jacob, but he lived longer than both of them. And so if length of life is a blessing, he was blessed with that. At one point it said his eyesight was weak, but he lived a long time after that and seemed to do pretty well. So maybe it came back, I don't know. Anyway, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. What's he talking about? This is from Genesis 27, where Esau is tricked by Jacob as far as the inheritance. And then he disguises himself as Jacob. Jacob disguises himself as Esau, I'll get it. And goes in to Jacob and receives a blessing from Isaac. And Isaac is deceived, thinking that he's talking to Esau. And so he gives the preeminent blessing to him, kind of the blessing for the elder brother to him.
Well, that was actually, wasn't that kind of engineered by Isaac's wife?
She
Yeah.
helped, yeah, she helped in the deception. And what in the world does this have to do with faith, though? Why is Isaac's faith mentioned in connection with this incident? It's an interesting case, you know, a nice story, if you will, an interesting story. But what does it have to do with faith? Isaac,
I believe that Isaac believed what he was doing was from God,
yeah,
that whatever he was going to say is going to happen.
yeah, that's his faith, and it was, you know, pretty detailed, and his brother would serve him, and that he would have many nations will serve you, and people bow down to you. And finally, when Isaac realizes it's not Esau, it's really Jacob, and Esau comes in and says, "Can't you do something for me?" And Isaac said, "Not really, I've already given the blessing to Jacob." The point is that this was God's plan, and it couldn't be changed. It was God revealed this, and Isaac in faith said this, you know, even it seems unfair that we're told Esau wept tears, and yet it couldn't be changed. It's interesting, though, that that's mentioned in the chapter about faith, predicting the future in faith.
Jacob's learning to be faithful, you know, and Isaac.
I guess so.
In life, you know, and through all these travails, I think they eventually are considered people to be faithful, you know. And
Well, we're gonna
Are they?
talk about Jacob's faith too, and what incident they choose for that. So, so just, yeah, keep that verse in mind. And then when he wants to talk about Jacob, what does he mention? By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. What went on there?
Kids were mixed up,
Yeah,
the grandson.
Joseph brings Ephraim and Manasseh to him and holds Manasseh in his left hand, which would be Jacob's or Israel's right hand, and he's got Ephraim on the other. He wants the natural blessing to go to his eldest, which is Manasseh, but Jacob foils him by crossing his arms and putting his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh, and says, yeah, that, you know, both of these are mine. Both of these are mine, which is something that happens because what they each receive a full portion, even though they're grandchildren, they receive full tribal portions. And one of his little sons, Levi, doesn't. And so the 12 tribes are maintained through the grandchildren there. And this is prophesied by Jacob there. And then he says, you know, gives the preeminent blessing to the firstborn, to the secondborn, Ephraim, and not as much to the firstborn, Manasseh. If you look at a map of Palestine, the way the land is divided up, Manasseh gets huge portions of land on the east side and the west side of the Jordan. Ephraim gets kind of a small bit just north of the Judah and Benjamin portions. But Ephraim turns out to be the dominant tribe in the whole northern kingdom. We can say, well, maybe that was because Joshua was of the tribe of Ephraim. We're going to read some of the other men who are mentioned as being faithful And Ephraim is going to come up in each of those cases, Gideon and Jephthah. And so we'll hear more about Ephraim popping up in those instances. But in other parts of the Old Testament, the whole northern kingdom is described as Ephraim. Ephraim has gone into idols. Ephraim will come back. But the point is that these are incidents of faith. Isaac kind of, see, the elder will serve the younger. Same with Jacob. The elder will serve the younger. In the case of Jacob, in the case of Ephraim and Manasseh. So it's interesting that those are chosen as instances of faith. You know, we could say a lot about Jacob.
Yeah.
He was a deceiver, and he was deceived, and yet somehow he's able to impart a reverence for God to some extent to his son, certainly Joseph.
Right. Eventually. Come around.
Eventually, yeah. We wonder, you know, must be a lot of teaching and living going on that we don't see. But anyway, so their faith is believing in what God says about the future, even though it's counter to what we might think. In our case, maybe it looks like the bad guys are winning, but really the good guys are going to win, is what the message of Jesus is. And so these examples suggest we need to believe that. It looks like it's going to be one way, but in actuality, it's going to be different. I don't know, that's what I got out of this.
There's one statement that Isaac made that looks like faith to me. So
Okay.
Esau came back and said, "My father, I'm here." And Jacob said, "Who is that I already blessed?" "Yes, and he shall be blessed," Jacob.
Okay,
So he believed that, at least he believed that.
Yeah.
And he went on. That's, not always that confident.
yeah, Isaac and Jacob, they must have gotten this information somewhere from God.
Well, it was revealed to Rebecca because of the two sons struggling in her womb. So she went to inquire of the
Okay.
Lord according to the text. And, the two sons, are two equal between nations, and the,
Younger will serve.
the young,
Yeah.
the older will serve the younger.
Yeah,
And so Rebecca does her way of trying to, ensure that what was said is going to happen.
and Jacob blessed all of his sons later, and we could read how those prophecies are fulfilled in the life of each one of them.
Also, what I read was that what Esau got was basically who he was. Okay?
Yes.
It matched who he was. It's not necessarily, you were, how can I trying to say the right word. You're empty, you got what you are, empty. Okay, you weren't interested in the things of God or anything like that, and so you got what you wanted, basically, what you deserve.
We're going to meet with him in the 12th chapter, and we'll see what word is used to describe him. In this version, it's called godless, like Esau. In the King James Version, the word that's used is profane Esau, because he didn't. What is profanity? I swear, but it's really not giving honor to what is due honor and respect. Profanity is if we use the name of the Lord in vain, or the concepts, important religious concepts, as just something to be mentioned in passing. That's profanity. So Esau did not have a deep respect for things that were worthy of respect. But anyway, we'll get to that. So that's Isaac and Jacob. Joseph, we mentioned briefly. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. And that, don't bury me here in Egypt. But so they embalmed him. He was an officer and finally took his bones back with them when they left Egypt.
That's 400 years, hold on to his bones.
Well, it was a long time, yeah. So, but that gave rise or came from a faith that the people were gonna go back to their own land as a promised land, no matter how long it took God to bring it about. When Jacob died, they had a little expedition right at that time to take his body back to Canaan and bury it in the cave of Machpelah or not. Anyway, that's another issue. But Joseph's were taken later. Looking forward again, how did Jacob get all this information? How did Joseph, was through a prophet, do a dream? We don't know.
No, but we know they were all driven by faith though. Faith is moving all of them forward in different ways at different times, but it's pushing all these people. That's why they're listed here.
They had the courage to speak about the future. And that's what faith, in our case, faith involves talking about the future, warning people about the future. There's going to be a judgment. This is not going to last forever. God has plans for his people, and there's things going to happen to people that aren't faithful. Moses is next. It's really not Moses, but who's next? By faith, Moses' parents, their names.
Yeah, they showed faith, put them in the water.
Okay,
That's not, that is not child abandonment. That
okay,
is, that was a method of maybe, somebody downstream might pick up the child. Okay, and, there was the hope that maybe somebody downstream might pick up the child and take care of the child.
Yeah.
I think that's used of, Cyrus too. I mean, they apply that, like.
yeah, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict, which was to kill all the male infants of the Israelites. What were the
I
names?
would have thought they were afraid of it, which is why they hid it,
Okay,
you know what I mean?
yeah,
So wording wise, it doesn't make sense. I mean, they hid him to protect from the child being killed, right? Because all children.
well, or try to get him in the Pharaoh's household.
Right.
They were not afraid of the king's edict.
So they had a lot of courage too.
What they should have
Not
done,
afraid of violating the king's edict.
yeah,
They had faith and courage.
I mean, they're
Child in
supposed
a river
to,
like that, come on. That was very dangerous.
they were supposed to put the male children to
Probably
death,
had
but they didn't
alligators
do
in that
that.
place. Alligators and all kinds of
Amram
fish.
is the father, Jochebed is the mother, and,
Maybe not afraid of violating the king's
yeah,
edict.
yeah. So, we want to keep those names in mind. Jochebed, as I recall, was his aunt. But anyway. So that's really the faith of the parents, seeing that he was not no ordinary child. I think any of us who have a child would say, he or she is no ordinary child, is my child. But so I don't know what they saw here. But maybe it was just that they had Miriam, the sister, and Aaron King. Anyway, that's another answer, a faith. These people are not afraid of doing God's will in spite of threats. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We remember that she picked him out of the water and he was raised as an Egyptian, as far as we know, but never was not aware of his true origin, which is interesting. You know, in a sense, we're all like Moses. We may not be raised in the palace. We may not be raised in a wealthy environment or an environment of power, but we're all raised in an environment which is an earthly one. And we have to keep in mind our true identity as children of God. It's great when our parents instill that within us. Some learn that later in life. But Moses, through association with his mother as his nurse, but it's easy to forget that. Some people would have got entangled in the life of Egypt, but not Moses. So we don't know a whole lot about that. We just have the one incident. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. The old verse says for a season. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Wow.
So he had a long-term view thing.
Okay.
There's no way he could do that.
Yeah, a longer term than.
That's the difference. He was no ordinary child. He had a long-term view.
Yeah.
How many children have a long-term view? Not there.
God gave him special.
Did he
Not
know about Christ?
Well, no, that's interesting, for the sake of
The
Christ.
disgrace of, what are they talking about? Disgrace similar to that which Jesus experienced? Or was it, just for the sake of the Lord? Different interpretations. I think it's the disgrace of the kind that Jesus endured. Or, some people say, well, Moses was a type of Christ. In some ways, I guess he was. But it's the type of reproach.
Yeah, Acts 7:25, he supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand.
Let's talk about this, where the two
Okay.
Hebrews are fighting one another.
That's a good reminder that we learned some things about what happened in the old days when Stephen is preaching. And that's one of the examples. Moses would have instituted rebellion or, wanted to take him back to the promised land when he was 40 years of age, because that seems to be what he's talking about there. But things weren't ready. They weren't ready to believe him. God wasn't ready for Moses to do it then. He had another 40 years of training for Moses. Then he sends him back. It would seem more logical. Moses is a young man. He's 40 years old. He's coming out of, being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That would seem to be strike while the iron is hot, but it wasn't in God's estimation. 40 years Moses had to live in the wilderness, and then he's ready. So
Like
God's
Jesus,
ways aren't
Like
always.
Jesus, right? Went in the wilderness
Okay.
for 40 days.
A
Moses went
wilderness
40 years.
experience.
Similar pattern there.
Jesus
It
was
was
a
kind of
faster
preparation.
learner.
Mhm.
What's that?
I said Jesus must have been a faster learner.
Yeah.
Okay.
Only 40 days, not 40
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, he got a crash course.
Yeah.
Moses got the old school method.
But God's ways aren't always our ways. he regarded disgrace. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. Why did he leave Egypt?
He had
Well,
killed a.
They killed a man, he was a wanted man.
yeah, but here, that's interesting, that we said, well, he wanted to get out of town fast. But here, the Hebrews writer says, not fearing the king's anger. He left, not fearing the king's anger. It wasn't because the king was after him, put him to death. Perhaps that verse that Michael read, the people weren't ready to go back to the promised land. So Moses leaves Egypt and God tells him when to come back.
In Acts 7, it seems that Stephen is hinting that Moses leaves because of the people.
Yeah,
In Exodus, it appears that he leaves because of Pharaoh, but, so it's the Hebrews probably harmonizing.
it just says not, he wasn't afraid, but maybe he just felt that was a good time to leave. But anyway, not fearing the king's anger. By faith, he saw him who is invisible.
That's faith, right there.
Yeah, at the burning bush.
Yeah, he's a person of faith at a young age.
By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. That's, we know in Exodus that he obeyed God's command, and the Passover, they passed over the Israelite homes. Moses then led the people. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. And there Moses stood up. The people, when they saw the Egyptians, they were afraid. Let's go back. Let's give up to Moses. They stood up in faith. Moses, go ahead.
Again, these are the same people that he mentions earlier in chapter 4, that they will never enter my rest, but yet they had faith. Okay, going back to the argument of once saved, always saved, and faith is a gift. Faith is a gift, God does not take his gift away. Okay, faith is a gift, faith not believe, therefore, once saved, always saved, because, you can't lose the gift of faith. But here, we see a very clear instance that the people had faith, okay, and yet we see earlier that he mentioned that they did not enter the Lord's rest. Also, it's repeated in the Exodus account several times. The people believed Moses. They believed Moses. So, some sort of faith they had,
Yeah, it was wobbly,
and
back and forth.
kind of like let it, gave up after the Red Sea.
Here, when they faced the Egyptian army as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after him. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" And that's not the first time that's one of the first times they murmured, not the last.
Also,
What have you done to us? But Moses, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. So that's typical of Moses.
sometimes I just came to it as we read the text, we think that we read Western machoism, Clint Eastwood,
Okay,
that John Wayne, whatever person you like, Sylvester Stallone, this machoism that in reading this list, we looked at these people were infallible, they were people who were of faith and bullets bounced off their chest without a problem or anything like that. they weren't afraid of anything, when we see the details.
No.
But it's before that, these people were perfect.
I mean, they had more courage and faith than fear.
But you got Abraham and Sarah that are mentioned, specifically Sarah related to, she considered him faithful who had promised. But you also know they both laughed,
Yeah,
Right.
they both doubted, right? But God is clearly seeing something more than just what we have recorded in the scripture within that. But they certainly had a moment of infallibility.
Right.
Moses, so he's an example of faith, and he was used by God, but Moses was not a perfect man. And that's one of the imperfections of these people are mentioned. I saw on a bulletin board in a church that I visited one time, Moses violated all of the 10 Commandments, and yet God used him.
Did?
Well, did he or didn't he?
No,
I'll let you think about that. Moses violated all of the 10 Commandments. And see if you can think of that, but
David's pretty easy to think about, you know, he was a man after God's
Yeah,
heart, but also the person that we probably think about from the Old Testament that did some pretty bad things.
Yeah.
Well, they all did something.
but their faith God could use them. I just wanted to mention, before we leave Moses, we're just about out of time. Moses is described later as the meekest man in the world. And for that reason, he was a man, that's a King James version again, but he was a man that could be used by God. And one of the things, as I read the Old Testament, that struck me as I was reading the book of Numbers, and that tells a lot about Moses. Just the last verse of each of the 4 chapters of Numbers, last verse of the first chapter, the Israelites did all this just as the Lord commanded Moses. Last verse of the second chapter, the Israelites did everything the Lord commanded Moses. That is the way they encamped under their standards and so on. Last verse of the third chapter, Moses gave the redemption money to Aaron and his sons as he was commanded by the word of God. Last verse of the 4th chapter about census. Thus they were counted as the Lord commanded Moses. See a pattern there?
He's a great leader.
A great leader because he submitted to what God told him to do. Like Michael was saying, we think of a leader as a guy who's out on his own, you know, and makes decisions right or wrong, but Moses was not that kind of a leader. He was a man who did what he was told because he had a faith in God.
He was meek enough. That's why he's the
That's
meekest
why
man.
he's the meekest
The Bible
man.
says he's the meekest man in the world.
That's right. That's right. Anyway, I mentioned those. I preached a sermon on that one time years ago. But we'll take up with the entry into the promised land next time. Thanks for putting up with going slow.
There's a lot in there.
Bring
A lot
out
in
the
there to
Old
dig out.
Testament references here.
A lot of history.
And,
The Jews still, they worship Moses practically today
Yes.
because of that. He's their savior. I feel. We got Jesus, they got Moses.
Didn't get to the
That's
promised
significant
land.
God must have
How you
been
doing,
talking to him as
Steve?
he was growing up.
Much better.
Who else
You
was
know,
teaching
bunch
him?
of the shingles.
I did,
Well,
yeah.
it's not-